This is a list of all video game lists, sorted by varying classifications. By platform. Acorn, list of Acorn Electron games, Apple platforms, list of Apple II games, list of Apple IIGS games, list of iOS games, list of Macintosh games, list of Pippin games, Amstrad, list of Amstrad CPC games, list of Amstrad PCW games, Atari, list of Atari 2600 games, list of Atari 5200 games, list of Atari 7800 games, list of Atari Jaguar games, list of Atari Lynx games, list of Atari Street games, list of Atari XEGS games, Bandai, list of WonderSwan games, list of WonderSwan Color games, list of Pippin games, Commodore, list of Amiga games, list of games on the Amiga CD32, list of Commodore 64 games, list of Commodore VIC-20 games, Fujitsu, list of FM Towns games, K-Pro, list of K-Pro games, Microsoft, list of games with DirectX 11 support, list of games for Windows titles, list of games for Windows Live titles, list of Windows games on demand, list of XBOX System Link games, list of MSX games, list of MS-DOS games, list of Windows games, list of XBOX games, list of XBOX 360 games, list of XBOX One games, list of Kinect games, list of XBOX Originals, list of XBOX 360 System Link games, list of XBOX 360 games on demand, list of XBOX Live games on Windows Phone 7, list of XBOX Live arcade games, NEC, list of PC Engine games, list of PCFX games, list of TurboGrafx 16 games, list of TurboGrafx CD and PC Engine CD games, Nintendo consoles, list of Family Computer games, list of Family Computer Disk System games, list of Nintendo Entertainment System games, list of Super Famicom games, list of SNES games, list of Nintendo 64 games, list of Nintendo GameCube games, list of Wii games, list of Wii U games, list of Satellaview broadcasts, list of Virtual Boy games, list of Virtual Console games for Wii, 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 list of Virtual Console games for Wii U, list of Virtual Console games for Wii U, list of Virtual Console games for Wii U, list of WiiWare games, Nintendo handhelds, list of Game & Watch games, list of games for the original Game Boy, list of Game Boy Color games, list of Game Boy Advance games, list of Nintendo DS games, list of Nintendo 3DS games, list of DSiWare games and applications, list of Virtual Console games for Nintendo 3DS, list of Virtual Console games for Nintendo 3DS, list of Virtual Console games for Nintendo 3DS, Panasonic, list of 3Do games, Philips, list of CDI games, list of Odyssey 2 games, Sega, list of Sega Master System games, list of Mega Drive Genesis games, list of Game Gear games, list of Sega Saturn games, list of Dreamcast games, list of Sega CD games, list of Sega 32X games, list of Tectoy Master System Collection 131 games, Sinclair, list of Sinclair QL games, list of ZX Spectrum games, SNK, list of Neo Geo games, list of Neo Geo Pocket Color games, Sony, list of PlayStation games, list of PlayStation 2 games, list of PlayStation 3 games, list of PlayStation 4 games, list of PlayStation Portable games, list of PlayStation Vita games, list of PlayStation Move games, list of PlayStation Network games, list of Song Classics, list of Sony Pictures Mobile games, Tandy, list of TRS-80 games, other platforms, list of PC Booter games, list of ColecoVision games, list of Gizmondo games, list of commercial GP32 games, list of HP 3000 games, list of Intellivision games, list of N-Gage games, list of all games, by publisher, list of games by Activision, list of games by Astragon, list of games by Blizzard Entertainment, list of games by Capcom, list of Electronic Arts games, list of games by Enix, List of games by Destination Software, List of games by Konami, List of video games by LucasArts, List of games by Namco, List of games by Nintendo, List of games by Sierra Entertainment, List of games by SNK, List of games by Square, List of games by Square Enix, List of Toito Games, List of games by THQ, List of games by Ubisoft, List of Wild Tangent Games, List of games by Zoo Digital Publishing, List of games by CI Games, by date. Chronology of 4X video games, Chronology of artillery video games, Chronology of baseball video games, Chronology of business simulation video games, Chronology of city building video games, Chronology of computer role-playing games, Chronology of console role-playing games, Chronology of God video games, Chronology of grand strategy video games, Chronology of massively multiplayer online strategy video games, Chronology of real-time strategy games, Chronology of real-time tactics video games, Chronology of roguelike video games, Chronology of spaceflight simulator games, Chronology of turn-based strategy video games, Chronology of turn-based tactics video games, List of Christian video games. By release, List of years in video games, Timeline of arcade video game history, by character or franchise, List of video game franchises, List of console game franchises, List of Hack Media, List of Bomani series, List of Bishmania games, List of Bomberman games, List of Castlevania media, List of Dance Dance Revolution video games, List of Digimon video games, List of Donkey Kong video games, List of Dizzy games, List of F-Zero media, List of Final Fantasy video games, List of Final Fantasy media, List of Guitar Freaks and Drum Mania video games, List of Harvest Moon titles, List of Kirby media, List of Mario media, List of Mega Man games, List of Metroid media, List of Mortal Kombat media, List of Poker Copyright Mon video games, List of games featuring Sonic the Hedgehog, List of Star Wars video games, List of Wario video games, Xenosaga lists, List of Zelda games, by feature, List of computer games with cooperative play, List of computer games with Spawn versions, by region, List of Japan-exclusive video games, List of Japanese Sega Mega Drive games, List of video games developed in the Czech Republic, List of video games developed in the Netherlands, by genre. Action, List of beat-em-ups, List of fighting games, List of first-person shooters, List of free first-person shooters, List of Grand Theft Auto clones, List of light gun games, List of platform games, List of third-person shooter games, casual, List of party video games, List of puzzle video games, List of maze video games, List of Tetris variants. List of quiz arcade games, role-playing, Chronology of computer role-playing games, Chronology of console role-playing games, List of massively multiplayer online role-playing games, Comparison of massively multiplayer online role-playing games, List of text-based MMORPGs. List of roguelikes, simulation, Chronology of business simulation video games, Chronology of city building video games, Chronology of God video games, List of simulation video games, List of spaceflight simulator games, sports, Chronology of baseball video games, List of Formula 1 video games, List of golf video games, List of volleyball video games, strategy, Chronology of 4X video games, Chronology of artillery video games, Chronology of grand strategy video games, Chronology of massively multiplayer online strategy video games, Chronology of real-time strategy video games, Chronology of real-time tactics video games, Chronology of turn-based strategy video games, Chronology of turn-based tactics video games, List of chess video games, other, List of adult video games, List of hentai computer games. List of arcade games, List of Christian video games by genre, List of graphic adventure games, List of platform games, by technology, List of cel-shaded video games, by license, List of free first-person shooters, List of freeware video games, List of open-source video games, List of commercial video games released as freeware, by reception, List of banned video games, List of best-selling video games, List of best-selling video game franchises, List of highest-grossing arcade games. List of commercial failures in video gaming, List of vaporware, List of video games considered the best, video games notable for negative reception, Other, video games notable for speedrunning, List of video game collector and limited editions, List of console games spanning multiple discs, List of video game exclusives, List of video game exclusives, List of video games based on anime or manga, List of PC exclusive titles, List of multi-platform games not available on PC, see also, List of video game consoles, List of video gaming topics, List of video game websites.